Hello everyone and welcome to a special episode of By the Numbers. You'll notice no Duncan Thorin Shields, my co-host. It's the first show he's missed since the show's inception. He's not going to be here because, as I said, it is special. We've brought on the highest level of representatives from ESL to talk about all of the changes, everything that's going on in the CSGO landscape right now, in particular the changes to the ESL Pro League. And that, of course, means that we've got the Flying DJs. He's known on Twitter. That's Ulrich Schulze. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation. He's the Senior Vice President of Product at ESL. And somebody I'm sure you all know. It is, of course, Michael Carmac Bleachers. I don't know. I've never been able to pronounce his surname in all these years. So apologies for butchering that as well. And he is the Vice President of Pro Gaming at ESL. So they're going to talk a lot about what's been going on. We thought it would be fair because of Duncan's kind of interest in the B-Site project that he wasn't here to, go at you guys, because I do want to present everything as fairly and impartially as possible. I don't particularly have a dog in the fight. My dog's always been Counter-Strike doing well. So let's just start, first of all, with where we're at, because while we were getting ready for the show, you were saying that it's been a tough week or two for you guys because you've had to read lots of things on the internet about you that aren't very pleasant and, more importantly, aren't very true. Could you elaborate on what those are?
Yoli, you want to take this one, or should I begin?
I can take it. I think there are lots of things on there that are true at the moment, and I think most of it is around the sentiment of teams that no longer have a spot in ESL Pro League. Obviously, that's something where, we communicated, we thought in time for all of them to still sign up for Mountain Dew League, but obviously too late at a point where they all thought they would be part of the season. And that is something, so their sentiments is something, I think what probably has surprised me is just how important the slot was to a lot of those teams. When you sometimes think it's just one of the tournaments each year, but for a lot of them it's a centerpiece, and where they build a lineup around and then they try to make other events. So I think all of that is true, I would say. What we didn't manage to do is, and that's where some of the speculation comes in that I think we're also responsible for, is we didn't really convey well, how things were going to work beyond that in future season, how you would be able to make it back, that this isn't a franchise league that is closed off. So all of those things, since we didn't really clearly communicate, it left room for people to speculate what we want to do, and that obviously can't blame someone for doing that. But that's something where we wanted to use the opportunity today to also talk a little bit about our intentions, plans going forward, to make sure it's understood and it's not just a news post and then you have to guess the further intentions behind it.
Anything to add to that, Carmac?
Well, I'll just come out and say we've been consistently shit at communicating with people. And this isn't necessarily like, we communicate with Valve well, and they know what we are about to do at any given point. We communicate well with a lot of the teams. We communicate well with a lot of the parties, but we kind of we've gone beyond that scale where we can communicate effectively, where it comes easy to us to communicate effectively with the community. And a lot of what happened, I think is warranted, the criticism, leaving teams, in uncertainty. The reason it kind of came to be was because the conversations with a lot of the teams about what the league would look like, what that would be, these things were shifting back and forth. Fairly critical things were shifting back and forth and changing from week to week almost. There was never really a time where, for example, there would be a list of all those teams that would be part of the reduction, like a real actual list. So from our perspective at the time, and in hindsight, we probably picked the wrong route to not communicate anything. But from our perspective at the time, I would say, okay, well, if we communicate something partial, for example, hey guys, there's going to be a reduction to Pro League, down to 24 teams or whatever, and then that opens up a Pandora's box, and literally dozens of teams have questions of, are we going to be a part of this? Are we not going to be a part of this? And these were questions that we were up until probably last Friday unable to answer. So in our minds, there was no, we didn't have anything that we were able to say to teams beyond saying that league would be reduced, and it would have been just chaos until we would, figure these things out. So that's the reason. In hindsight, that was the wrong choice, but in hindsight, many things become very, very clear. So we spent a bunch of time this week, Oli and I and a couple of others, to talk to the teams that were part of the reduction, to figure out how they feel, figure out if our ideas for how we could potentially rectify it go along what they would be looking for from us. Because I mean, we can come up with ideas, but ultimately, if you're hungry and we give you a gallon of water, it doesn't really help you so much, right? And yeah, maybe if while I'm talking, to address a little bit the other part of the controversy and the criticism, which is the word invite. If you look at our timeline, there's a fairly, let's say, logical reason why that was used. Internally, what we always wanted to do is communicate last Friday is the last possible day, to let the teams know that, hey, you're a part of the reduction. If you want to have a sure way back into the Pro League, you need to qualify for Mountain Dew League. And Mountain Dew League signups end 3 days from Friday or something like that. Don't remember exactly. And the Mountain Dew League season was actually pushed by 2 weeks already, so that we could have a little bit more time, so that those teams wouldn't be, told, hey, you've been part of the reduction of the Pro League, and at the same time you can get back in through Mountain Dew League, which has started, by the way. So goodbye, thanks very much. So there was a big kind of ticking clock for us to announce it by Friday the latest. And by Friday the latest, the best word that we could use to announce a list of teams that would be, at least in our minds, participating, and by the same token announce all the teams that wouldn't be participating, the best word that we were able to use at the time was invite, basically. Because plenty of teams, we understood, were interested in playing, but they have boards, they have slightly more complicated approval processes, and we simply couldn't get to a stage where everyone was comfortable with a stronger word than invite. But the reason we used it is because we wanted to say something on that Friday, not because we wanted to be sinister in any kind of way.
Well, so let's just rewind a little bit. The first thing that I want to pick up on is the idea that you could have been better at communicating. What's been said by all of the teams that have been impacted by these changes was that there wasn't any communication, and they were trying to initiate communication. This was a consistent thing that all of the Mountain Dew League teams, or the newly created Mountain Dew League teams, have said, that they wanted to know what was going on. They were aware there were some changes coming to the league, and they found out through DK's reporting, not from ESL officials. So while I understand you're saying, we're shit at communicating, what they're saying is there was no attempt to communicate with them whatsoever, and they found out publicly. There's also another point, and I believe you've been tagged in this, but this was something I was going to bring up anyway. The list of teams that was proposed for the changes, this goes back. I mean, the earliest draft agreement that we've seen was February. There was a list of teams created in May. So you've had all of this time to at least prepare those teams for the changes. But what's actually happened is they found out maybe a week or two before those changes are implemented. It seems to me impossible that nobody at ESL could have took responsibility to let the teams know about that. So what happened?
Yeah, I think it's there's a few things. One is obviously there's lots of people that communicate to teams on our end, and it wasn't always visible to us, when teams had asked, and we internally, because that was the, really what the situation was at the point, we'd said, there's nothing 100% confirmed yet for Pro League next season, so we can't say that. Now that how you word that to a team is obviously something. That in the process from, it's not 100% confirmed yet, just turned out to be, at the teams it came, like there's no new information. So you just have to be patient, which isn't great. I understand that's not great. I know that Fraud, Denny from Sport Patrol, at some point he messaged me on Twitter and said, I need information on this. So I responded back to him, told him, I'm sorry it's taking so long, but there's just things that we need to figure out. So we'll give you more information. And then I think he messaged me again on the day that the agreement was leaked. So that is incredibly unfortunate. But one thing I want to point out is the discussion with the teams has been going on for a very long time. That's true. And the format has been something that very early on we decided this was the direction we would be going on. But I think, if you look at any of those documents, then especially say a year ago or 8 months ago, that was a list of teams that were supposedly going to be part of it, but none of them had signed, confirmed, or in any way committed to being in Pro League at that time. And there was also parallel discussions going on that impacted Pro League and which teams would be in it, which is all the teams that now don't play Pro League because they play something else. So I think we invited Made in Brazil and the Cloud9 lineup, and they said, well, no, we're going to play something else. So all of this wasn't something, I think it's what Michał mentioned before, is the only thing we could have said at that time, really, and even 3 months ago, is yes, our idea is to, if we can align with everyone on this, because it's also dependent on us working with the teams together. Not sure if, out of our own, without having any kind of agreement or bigger plan, we would have changed the format, because it obviously has some long-lasting impact. So the only thing we could have said, say 3 months ago, is this is the plan, this is the idea of what we're going to do, but there's a list of teams that we would like to be in there, but the teams hadn't even figured out or were still thinking about it. Then there's teams that we would invite, but we also don't know if they're going to compete. So it would have created, I think, what Michał mentioned, this level of uncertainty, and that was, I think, why we even internally among employees, we didn't want to create something where we said, it's going to change, but nobody knows who's going to be in it. What then obviously turned out is that we didn't communicate at all about it, but just said this is a plan, so we talk about when it gets concrete. And I think that's the challenge, right? So it wasn't that we had this plan in a drawer for a year and we're just waiting for it to be pulled out and to be shared with the teams, but rather we knew this was going to be the idea under the assumption we can get to an agreement, everything works out in terms of monetization and the plans we have around it, and considering what other teams are doing, which teams might be doing other leagues, or how they're going to go about it. And then obviously in the middle of it, I think we'll get to that point. And also we had a conversation with Valve, and after a while, after I think everyone had shared their plans for leagues, they made this blog post that again changed things, right? Because it changed some of the core elements that we had in there in the earlier agreements. So I think it was really lots of moving pieces, which, now that everything's working out, it looks like everything was planned months ago and could have been shared by then. But to us, it really wasn't clear if this was going to work out. So it wasn't possible for us to tell the teams, here's our Pro League is going to change. So we could have told them we might change it and you might lose your spot. But I don't know if that would have been better. Maybe, but in hindsight, it definitely would have been better to say at least a few weeks ago to tell them it's likely that we're going to change the format and the teams are going to lose their slot. So don't, plan your rosters based on it. Don't spend money based on it.
So, the next question I would sort of throw in there is, I mean, because we'll talk about some other parts of the, so-called Lanxess agreement in a moment, but I think the big issue, one of the reasons why ESL have found themselves in a firing line is that you have sort of just removed slots from teams that have kind of like rightfully earned them. I'll be honest with you, Uli, I think it's disingenuous to say that you guys aren't aware of the importance of an ESL Pro League slot, and especially when it's been a big selling point for your league, that being in that league is sort of, quite an accolade. But for a lot of those teams, they come in and they have an agreement with you that they're going to play their games out, that they're not going to drop when they've lost games and they can't get promoted. They're still going to see out the season. They're going to turn up on time. They're going to participate and adhere to all of your rules. And surely the quid pro quo for that is that you're going to honor your side of the agreement and give them the slot and all the financial benefits that come with it. For a lot of these teams, it's a selling point to sponsors to be in that league. So I'm trying to, find a way that it's justifiable that for your partners that have adhered to all of your rules, you've taken that away from them and offered them something that, even with the changes you've announced today that we'll get to, is inarguably inferior.
I think it's an absolutely valid point. I think there's something that's being taken away. I think it's something that we have provided, and it's fairly unique. I mean, it was, and I think to this point, even with the changes, still is the biggest league out there that supports a lot of different teams. Now, I think we've grown Pro League. We started with smaller divisions in North America and Europe. They were just online, and we moved to larger divisions, and then we also included Asia at some point. So it had grown to quite a size. Now I understand each team's claim to their spot. That it's totally valid. It's hard for us to go do this forever, because for us, what really turned out is that the regional division that we had wasn't working out well, because for several reasons it wasn't great. I think when we think about a league, then we would think about something that's different than your regular tournament. But what we ended up doing, even with the different format last year, is we did something which had a large glorified qualifier in each region, and then when you go to the finals, it's a 16-team event that isn't really different outside of, say, prize money from any of the other events that we have. So the distinction wasn't great. We had CSGO is still very audience heavy in the CT time zones. We had a large amount of teams that were playing in a time zone that wasn't ideal. So to us, it was, from a product perspective, something that we felt we needed to do. Now, at this point, we have 48 teams. 48 teams in a single division is cost prohibitive for us, unfortunately. So we have to make a cut at some point. I think that in itself is something that might be defensible. I think the things that are going to be more questionable, and we can talk about those, is why are certain teams in now that maybe didn't have a slot before, and now they have.
Yeah,
one.
well, that was where I was going to go next. I'll bring Carmac in. Obviously, you've been quiet for a while there, letting Uli kind of take point. I'm sure you've got your own thoughts. You're somebody that's old school esports. You go back further than even me. So, you understand the importance of having long-term goals that teams can work towards to build their brands. And when that's taken away from people, obviously that's, hugely detrimental.
Well, I'd say overall, just to keep things in what I think is a slightly more, let's say, proper perspective, is when it comes to the teams that are aspiring to break through, let's say the break into the perennial invite zone, so to speak, where you get invitations because you're high in one ranking or the other. Then unless you fall on your face at the main event, you're going to win some points, and that's going to keep you up. So it's very difficult to break into that. North, for example, was a team that kind of fell out and then really tried very, very hard to get back in, even though they were probably already good enough. So we've created actually in the ESL Pro Tour a number of connections where you can you don't have to rely on the ranking, but you actually, if you're playing the, let's say, Polish national championship, German national championship, French national championship, if you win that, you're guaranteed to go to a DreamHack Open, and if you win that, you're guaranteed, like literally given the ticket to a Masters event, ESL One or DreamHack Masters or IEM and things like that. So we generally have done a lot in order to try to improve that ability to climb for any team. So while at the same time we did reduce the number of teams in Pro League, which is a fact, which is not something that a lot of the teams enjoy. I would say we were in a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because if you talk to teams on either, participating in either league, they were probably not very happy with status quo, and they went about very actively figuring out how to change status quo, right? To see if there's a model that they can adopt from another esports game or from maybe a traditional sports league model, where they would have more sustainability, where their structures would provide more reassurance to their investors, where they would get additional value beyond just the opportunity to win a trophy. On one level, it was for us to see, okay, we will play along with that. Or we see the top teams leave and try to do that elsewhere, right? That's what the PEA was about, right? So to some degree, and I'm not going to use that as a 100% excuse. It's not like we were extorted or anything like that, but to some degree we had a difficult choice of seeing a lot. I don't know what kind of number of top teams leaving the Pro League to try to pursue something else, and potentially seeing Pro League just fail through losing relevance because of the participants that chose to play or not play in it. That's also a factor that was considered.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just put this question out there, and then we'll pontificate a little on that point. How do you justify, including a complexity which didn't play in your league? I imagine hasn't made a dent in the ESL World Ranking as of yet. And you don't put Havu in, you don't put Spirit in, you don't put a Sprout in. Teams of this nature that did everything the correct way, they're not going to be part of this league. They're cast out to the Mountain Dew League, and Complexity, who realistically should have to come through a qualifier, they're included seemingly because of their status, reach, and money.
I think just very quickly on casting someone out to Mountain Dew League. I'll come to the Complexity one in a bit, but I think I want to make sure that we just reiterate, which I think we've also done in news. We want to build Mountain Dew League as a division of Pro League that helps long-term give teams the same amount of stability that they've now, even if they weren't, say, in the top 20 level, that they've now had from Pro League. I understand that's not there right now. We're absolutely intending it to be. And we've talked to teams like Sprout. We understand their pains. And a lot of the things that we've announced today and that we're going to announce are really based on their direct feedback. And I mean, absolutely, we should have, had that dialogue in detail a lot sooner. But that's what we're doing right now. So it's absolutely our goal to build Mountain Dew League to something that isn't seen as, you're out of Pro League, but rather you're not at the top level yet, but almost getting there. Sorry.
Yes.
No. Just to Complexity.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair point, and I think we can be open about it. We and the other teams that we're working with, which I think is important, right? I mean, this isn't ESL selected a group of teams and went with it, but rather a group of teams got together and decided to work with us. So complexity was part of that group, and why and is part of that group, and why are they part of that group? I think it's because Jason Lake has been in space for a long time, so a lot of people trust him to not look after short-term gains, to not chase something that isn't core to esports, and I think that's a valuable asset as we're building something long-term and sustainable. That's one thing. Obviously, there's a lot of investment from complexity may not have yet paid out in performance or results, but they invest into the space. Even after they haven't had success for a while, they now have a new lineup. So there's a lot of things that they're willing to do. They did play Pro League last season. They didn't finish it. That's true. Because at the time when they're changing their roster, and our rules didn't actually allow them to play with the new roster at that time. So that was, I think, it's partially on them, but partially also on the rules. So,
but there are usually penalties for not finishing a season. Is that correct?
Typically, yes, but it's, I mean, if you don't finish the season, then in most cases you don't make the final. So we consider the loss and prize money is ultimately enough. And I think we need to punish teams beyond that. But yeah, I mean,
understand as well. I would consider myself a complexity fan. I consider Jason a personal friend, but it just seems on the surface, my sympathies have to go to the teams that they ultimately replace in what seems to be kind of an unfair circumstance. I mean, listen, from a business perspective, if you were to sit down and offer me a team that has, and I won't name anybody because I don't want to be disparaging, but if you would offer me a team that, doesn't have a great squad and doesn't have a great reach, doesn't have a great brand, certainly isn't backed by the same money as the Dallas Cowboys, or offer me complexity as a partner, it's a no-brainer for me from a business perspective. But I think when it comes to competitive integrity, it's almost like you have to put those things aside, because the appearances, this ESL Pro League is like something completely new, and all the history and everything else and all the qualifiers, everything you've done before that, irrelevant now. We're starting from zero, and we are going to arbitrarily assign which teams we want to be in this league with a big revenue share and new rules and everything else. And the teams that thought they were going to maybe get a piece of this, we just don't want them because they're not big enough for our needs, essentially. And, this is why I think ESL probably should just be honest about how essentially ruthless this cut was. I think that would be a better PR strategy, honestly.
And I think, I mean, we can be honest about the teams that signed the agreement and that are member teams. Obviously, there are a number of factors that determined to go with them. And it wasn't just, competitive performance. I think that's something that, yes, that's the case. Because that's ultimately, it's a part of what drives business. But since they're also making decisions together, building things together long term, the performance of the players at that point in time isn't necessarily the only factor. So yes, absolutely. For those teams, that was something where the business element of it played a big role. I'm not going to accept it for the other part, because if we're looking at the teams that we invited for this season, then I think we can say it was unfair to the teams that had a slot before, absolutely. But outside of the teams that we signed the agreement with, the other teams we took and that accepted to play, maybe Brazil, for example, didn't. They're playing B-side, obviously, but the other teams are the top 16, the remaining ones from last season of Pro League. So that was absolutely performance-based. And then the rest was done through the world ranking that we currently have. Now, we can argue how accurate that world ranking is. Fine, I don't think we have the time right now to do it, but that's how we went about it. Sure. Yes, absolutely, you can do it. But just wanted to point out that, yes, there's a group of teams where I'm not going to get into an argument where I'm going to defend their inclusion based on just competitive performance. But for the rest of the teams, at least for this season, and then hopefully also for the seasons beyond that, what we really paid attention to is that there's a clear measurement for why they're included. They were either finalists at last Pro League season, or they were high enough in the world ranking to be included. And going forward, we're going to follow that logic with one caveat that we're now obviously giving the teams that dropped a special chance in the qualifier model for season 12. But so that's how we went about it. But yes, I mean, complexity is in a group of teams where I think for the majority of them, no one's going to question their place in there based on both brand as well as the performance of their roster. But I wouldn't be able to say that for every one of them. There's a few mechanisms we have in place. I know I'm, drifting off a bit maybe, but for example, for this permanent slot in the league, we do have mechanisms in place that if you do poorly as a team, if you're really not up to the competitive requirements of the league, then your slot will be in question at some point to make sure that we can't perpetually have Shanghai Dragons in the league. In Overwatch League, they are
Sure.
They were the team that lost a lot in one season. So
you brought the ranking up there, and again, I'll bring you in here, Carmac, if you've got anything to say about the ranking. I think in particular what we saw with the way the ranking was being handled, there's this recurring thing that I don't understand. And it seems to be that in a lot of areas the ESL philosophy isn't assimilate. Like the Borg or something. It's actually you want to supplant and replace things that we already have. Now, if I wanted to create a ranking, for me, the obvious thing I would do is I would look to maybe get a partnership with HLTV. They already have one. It's very well respected. It's considered the gold standard. Whatever you think about the publication, the people who run it, I think we can all agree on that. Why is it that ESL, first of all, wanted to have their own ranking, which creates a lot of questions about potential conflict of interest, because obviously we all know you've got WISA teams you could give preferential rankings to, especially now that your place in the league is contingent on that ranking. But also, why was it in the contract that players had to specifically tweet about your ranking, and there was going to be penalties if they mentioned anyone else's ranking? I mean, that's complete madness, isn't it?
So on the tweets, I think it was just to correct you, it was teams tweeting, not players.
Okay.
So that was just teams. Second, I
don't think we had penalties in there.
I don't think there were any penalties. I haven't read the contract as many times as Uri did, but
I think the only penalties we had were for not fulfilling the promotional requirements. I think
that's what I'm saying. The promotional requirements included the tweets, right?
Right, but there was no specific need to tweet about the ranking.
The thing about the ranking, just to level set a couple of things. First of all, there's no one at ESL that thinks that the ESL World Ranking would become the global ranking for Counter-Strike, because I don't think there's anybody at ESL foolish enough to think that tomorrow StarLadder or Blast Pro Series or B-Side decide to adopt the ESL ranking as their own. So there's no one out there that's insane enough that thinks that ESL will have a global ranking that will be the all-encompassing world ranking. The idea with the ranking is essentially we want to use a ranking for a lot of things. For example, seeding, for example, invitations. That these are things that are fairly critical for us. The only way we can skew the ranking is at the design stage. And when you design certain kind of engine, you can't really future-proof it to always prefer team A or team B or team C. That's not how it works. We don't tinker with the engine just to reverse engineer results. So I've been speaking about the ranking with the HLTV guys, and they actually supposedly get a lot of flack because supposedly their ranking prefers the Danish teams, for example, because those guys are Danish, which is obviously quite absurd. And by the same token, ours doesn't really, ours is just a mathematical engine that's built on certain principles that our math geeks believe in, that are slightly different philosophically from HLTV's ranking. But for the most part, if you step 1 mile away from it, they work very similarly, actually. So if you ask me, can we sit down at a table one day with HLT and talk about things? Yes, we can. Now, when it comes to why that thing was in the contract, because it's like if you read it, if you're an outsider, you go, holy shit, that's madness, right? It kind of looks mad. It genuinely does. To some degree, this is actually, so what happens is with these negotiations, we got a guy in a shirt and jeans, we got a business casually dressed guy, you got a guy in a fucking tracksuit with got a gold chain and a very short haircut, all negotiating about esports. And on the side of it, there's an ESL lawyer who's a gamer writing all of that stuff down, and then somebody nods, you're going to put that in the contract. Yeah, okay. So basically some stuff that gets worded in a way that usually never makes it to the final one is there at some stage. Is there at some stage in the contract. To be completely honest with you, I remember glancing through that section when I read the contract. I didn't notice that, like to what degree, what exactly was written in there. And somebody from HLTV texted me saying, "What the hell is what is this?" And then I looked at it. That looks a little bit insane. And then we just went back and we just erased it. That's literally what happened there. But typically towards the end, everything that's, let's say, in beta just ends up getting removed because towards the end, everybody starts really paying attention to all the paperwork.
Just one thing I wanted to mention, and sure. I mean, it's not going to negate any of the points that Carmac made, obviously, and which are all true. But we created our ranking not as a play to have something of our own that nobody else had, but it was actually a few years ago that we did. And I mean, HLTV ranking, I think, is fairly okay right now. You could argue how how volatile it is and how fast teams can move up and down, maybe. But it wasn't too long ago that it was relaunched, and only after that it became something that was really widely recognized as accurate and representative. So before that, there wasn't a good ranking, and it was at a time when we increasingly were getting criticized for why do you invite that team, why do you invite this team. I think we had I remember Dubai, for example, lots of controversy about TSM at the time not getting invited and all those things. Plus there wasn't really a great way to seed teams at our events. It wasn't random, and it didn't really put our admins into question to some extent, because people thought they were fixing the groups, so didn't really know how to do the groups. So the ranking was actually born out of an idea where we said, we need something like that. We need something that we can show to the public where we say, look, we're ranking all of those important tournaments. And that's what we based our invites on. We looked at this list. So that's a fairly objective criteria to determine who's going to our events. And that's also what we based the seeding on. Now, I totally agree with Mihal. I don't think people, when they hear ESL ranking, they think it is what it really is, which is it ranks all tournaments. It doesn't have a bias to ESL tournaments beyond, say, what maybe happened when the methodology was created, even though it was done by a director of league operations who is as German and as much of a mathematician as you can imagine, and he's opposed to any kind of bias. So that's it is really impartial in how the ranking works, but with an ESL ranking, nobody suspects it to really be impartial. So that I think that's a valid point, and where we ultimately, together with what Mihal just said, our goal is just to find something that helps us determine invites. Now, I think it's probably worth a separate show, but there's a lot of arguments to be had about how much is it player-based and how much is it also tied to teams. Because I think for seeding, if you want to just have 16 teams put into groups, then you need it player-based, right? It needs to really represent just pure skill. Now, if you're looking at the teams, if it's purely player-based, that's really rough for organizations, because if your invites depend upon it, and then say, and that's actually in our ranking like that, if your players all leave and they go to a different organization, they take all their points with them. So you've invested all this money to those players. They go. They not only are they gone, but they also take all the invites basically with them because another organization now gets invited. So I think those are things that where we are right now that aren't black and white, but where they need to be figured out. And I think ultimately I don't think we have an intent of saying we want something that favors ESL events. Especially now we have a Pro Tour ranking that leads to Cologne and Katowice, so that's really what our ESL world where ranking exists, and it is just ESL and Remake events part of Pro Tour with the clear goal of qualifying to Cologne and Katowice. And for everything else, if we can find something that really helps us determine who should get invited to an event and do proper seeding, that's the end goal. And it's not about having an ESL sticker on it or not.
Just in regards to invites as well, one of the things that came out when the Lanxess agreement, one of the earlier drafts of it, was made public, was that you were going to assign the invites based on the ranking we've just been talking about, and teams wouldn't be able to decline to in a calendar year. They would have to accept the invites. So there's this situation where a company that dominates the largest part of the esports calendar can essentially sort of have whatever teams it wants at whatever events it wants, and essentially leverage the threat of you losing an entire year's worth of revenue if you decline more than these two invites. That's a hell of a leveraging tool against your competitors in the space. Do you think that's maybe a little bit egregious?
I think that's being presented a little bit. I don't know if incorrectly is the proper word, but what we have in the agreement as one of the core principles is that teams get a revenue share and a profit share from the ESL Pro League, and that's one pot. And the other pot is a revenue and profit share in the ESL Pro Tour. Now, obviously, if you want to take a revenue or profit share from a product of some kind, you need to deliver value to it and you need to participate. So if you want the part of the pot that's from the ESL Pro Tour, then you need to attend those events. Otherwise, you're not eligible for the profit and revenue sharing. That's basically it, which is, I mean, let's say you're a celebrity and you get paid money or a revenue share to attend parties, and you don't attend those parties. Obviously, you're not eligible. You shouldn't be eligible for the revenue share from that. However, if a team that is designed in a way that if a team should get a better offer with better revenue share or maybe straight cash to go to an event somewhere in, I don't know, the Middle East, and it's a better deal for them, go ahead. It's absolutely your choice. But what you would be potentially sacrificing if you, let's say, don't show up to enough ESL Pro Tour events is your piece of the ESL Pro Tour revenue share, not the Pro League share.
And just maybe as an additional note, I mean, that's been something we obviously the teams have raised this point a lot. We've discussed it a lot. It's been something that's very important to them as well. So that's I think what was in the early agreements was actually we've now reached a different option as a bit softer, I think. And obviously something we also discussed with the players and the CSPPA as they also care about this. I think ultimately. I think everyone understands on the team side, on the player side, that a level of working together and sharing revenue, which also means generating more revenue, so that you can share the amounts, only works if there's an element of predictability, and that isn't there if you can just decline anything. So I think what we wanted to achieve, and what really is important to us, is for those teams that want to share in the revenue, want to be a core piece of that also want the benefits of being able, if they're ranked highly enough, to select events to go to, that they also commit to us, yes, we'll be at at least X of your events. So I think that's the way we look at this, where we're saying, out of those teams, we don't want to risk the majority not going to large events if we're sharing revenue with them, right? If they don't want to share revenue, obviously, then that's a completely different discussion. But if they want to do that, then they should be events. And I think that's all the teams accepted. I think all the players accepted where we ended up right now. And just one thing, I think we can't tell anyone where to go, right? There's no provision in there, and we don't intend to be able to tell a team, look, you're going to the Bahrain event, because we think it's really important to go there, even if they don't want to. So it's up to them to choose. I think we have some built-in mechanics, like you can decline Cologne if you want to, but probably wouldn't, because it's one of the most important events.
Sure.
No, there's no invites to Cologne anymore.
Right. But you can still decline it, right? It's
of course, yeah.
But then teams can essentially select which events to go to if they are part of the agreement. But they can choose which ones to decline. And ultimately, they can decline more. And I think, we've obviously worked with teams for a long time, not just now, but as part of WESA. And I think there's lots of things to be said about it, how we launched and how we went about it and how it was positioned. But I think one thing is that nothing evil has come out of this. If you ask any of the teams that we've worked with, and we've shared revenue with them for a long time in this, and I think we've had a very pragmatic relationship. That also, where we talked about, how is the CS:GO ecosystem currently structured? Which events should we play? How does it work? And sometimes for us, I think, you were part of that when 5 years ago, some guys from Vulcan said, let's build an exclusive league and talk to teams. And we said, well, we did need to do something about it. So let's see what we can do. But after that, I think we were fine with Pro League, how it existed next to ECS, next to E-League, because there was just, it was just at a point where esports at that time was, we could monetize. It wouldn't have been significantly better if we were the only league, because everyone is still building those sponsors and even getting them excited. So it was good that E-League, they got sponsors in the US that we wouldn't have been able to reach at that time, the other way around. So I think from our side, we've always been pragmatic about it. And here, really, it isn't about us trying to force teams into attending our events, but rather us together with the teams, and really together, right? We didn't force it upon them. Where we said, this is really the amount of events that we need you at to be able to justify giving you this amount of money back, at least today, and then hopefully build to something where in the future it gets to a stable state, both for teams and for everyone else.
One data point there.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
If I may just interject for a second.
Absolutely, yeah, jump in.
In practice, what was leaked, I don't think it's in the final. But what was leaked in practice over the last 24 months, I believe only one of the teams that we invited declined more times than was in the paperwork. So in practice, if you were to apply those rules retrospectively, only one of the probably over a dozen teams that we've invited would have declined more times than we assumed in the early stages of the agreement.
Okay. Well, look, so here's the big one. This is the big question that I definitely wanted to ask. And it's kind of about the ESL philosophy and the ESL way of doing things. Uli already kind of alluded to it a little bit, going back to the first attempt at what was kind of an, called an exclusivity league, where all of the stakeholders, all the team owners were in the Twitch building, and Vulcan were involved, and they were going to handle fantasy. And all that nonsense. And obviously, I'm the guy that put that story out there, and the community seemed to resoundingly reject it. I feel that ever since then, ESL have been looking for a way to have essentially the same thing, and they've just constantly repackaged it, whether it's WESA, whether it, whatever it might be. And, it's worth pointing out that in the original draft of this agreement, the original plans that you guys had was that you cannot play in any of the league if you commit to the ESL Pro League. Which obviously, that might be how American sports works. That might be what's vogue for Activision Blizzard and stuff now. But traditionally, it's an anathema to the CS community. We have the open tournament system. People go on invites. People come through qualifiers. That's how it's always been, and that's what fans are used to, and I would say they prefer. So I've just got to ask, why is it that ESL feel this need that they always go with the most controlling option to begin with, and then via a combination of stakeholders coming out and community outrage, they eventually revise their position to be something a bit more soft and a bit more in line with what the fans want? Why is it that ESL seemingly always want to monopolize Counter-Strike?
Yeah, I mean, I would say seemingly is the right word, and I'm not going to state that we don't want this and others are forcing it upon us. And I'll get to the reasons why it might be beneficial to some extent in a bit. I think for a large part we've been reactive. I think when Vulcan came about, that was reactive. It wasn't, we weren't attempting it first, but we felt a threat to our business at that time that we needed to react to. And I think the same thing happened now, and obviously we have stakeholders that no longer are involved. Like we discussed with Noah Winston for a long time, for example, then left Immortals. And again, what we have right now, it was to a large extent initialized by the teams. Now, I'm not going to say the teams are the only one, but I'll just briefly explain, I think, why they're interested in this. And I think you can tell a little bit when you listen to Dan Fight and talk about B-Side why they're interested in this. I think as a team right now, you don't have a lot of equity in CSGO. You have your brand, and that's sometimes large and really important. I think if we look, for example, I think people always question why do we work with certain teams, but if we look at FaZe viewership, no matter what players they have, it's significantly better than viewership for any other team, and it comes from their brand, for example. But teams don't have a lot of equity beyond that. If their lineup is gone, their entire stake and position in the scene might be gone. I think Cloud9 is a good example, right? Winning the major, then having lineups that don't do well, and all of a sudden they drop from everything. They still get included in Blast events, but Blast gets incredibly heavy criticism for that because nobody considers Cloud9 to be good enough to be included. So that's a problem for team, and I understand that, right? They need some element of predictability. So I think the teams have for a long time wanted something like that. And it's interesting because with Western, for example, we didn't have permanent slots. Virtus.pro is a Western member. They dropped out of Pro League, and then they were in Mountain Dew League, and until they got through with a new team now that has a better world ranking, they were still in Mountain Dew League. They never made it back up. So for teams, that's really the piece, and I think it will be really helpful once we have everything set and ready to announce. So also hear teams' perspective, but the teams are looking for something like that. Now, why can't it just be a league and then other leagues? I think it's. If we're looking at how monetization works, I understand that everyone would like freedom to choose and lots of different tournaments, and then as a viewer you pick the best ones. That's great, but if you're looking at monetization, say selling to big sponsors or selling to big media rights partners, if you want a sport to do well, like football does, then it needs to be a seller's market. It needs to be one party selling and lots of parties interested in buying. That would be the ideal scenario. So ideally, you have something that all media rights partners want to broadcast. So you put out, ask them to put in a bid, and then you select the highest at some point. That's how it monetizes. But then that money goes to teams and everyone and the league, and so you can somehow finance the business. Now, if you have a buyer's market, it's the other way around. And I think it's a little bit what we had in CS in the past. And there's a few examples, right? So on the platform sides, how many are actually viable? We've had Pro League on Twitch. It worked well. We've had Pro League on YouTube. It also worked fairly well. Some transitioning. We have Pro League on Facebook. It bombs. I think we need to be honest about that, right? It was really, really terrible. So at that point, you lose your power as someone who's selling media rights when you know that you can't actually sell to all platforms. And I think even Mixer, right? They're making moves right now, but it would be difficult to put a property that really depends on viewership, right? I mean, someone like a Ninja, he'll take a check. If his viewership is terrible, it's not great for him, but he still makes his money.
Yeah.
With a Pro League product, if we don't have the eyeballs, then we're losing relevance, we're losing interest from sponsors. So it's all interconnected. So at that time, when you have only a few platforms that are really actually viable, but then there's so many different Counter-Strike properties and even similar properties. And I think the value of a league was always in, it has a few weeks of content that ideally isn't interrupted by anything else. You can sell to someone, this is 4 or 5 weeks of CS, and in those 4 or 5 weeks, you can only get it here. If there's multiple leagues competing and there's actually only a few media rights partners that are relevant, then they can turn it around, right? They will select whoever gives them the best offer, because ultimately they might not care much about which one it is, as long as they get some CS content. Especially if we look at, say, traditional TV partners, when they're moving into the space, most of the times they're not educated. So sometimes it's just about esports, and then if they're a little more refined, then it might be about CS. But then at that point, they might not care if it's Blast or Pro League or B-side. So that's where the idea comes from, that there's a value to having this level of exclusivity. And I'll stop my monologue in a bit, but there's this value of exclusivity when you want to build a sustainable business. What we did is we were upfront about this, and to Valve and to everyone else, we said we think, and the teams have signaled us that this is what they want to do. They would like to compete in tournaments, and I think we had a day restriction that was based on how many tournament days teams actually played. So it wasn't something that would have restricted them, but just took what was already there. But then on the league side, I think all teams, B-side, Blast, everyone at that time had planned to say, this is the only league you play in. And we were upfront to Valve about this. We said, we think this is where it's going. We think, might be worth trying. And here's our plans. And then after they'd heard this from a few parties, they decided to put out that block. So it wasn't surprising. But that's how all of this happened. And it's not about, I think, grabbing necessarily power to us, but I think people are, it's hard to understand the nuances behind how things are getting sold. But really this, right now, with 3 leagues in the market, monetization has become harder. Obviously, if one of them becomes much bigger, much more relevant, then it might be a different case. But that's how it was. But both teams and players, to be honest, in all of the conversations we had at that time, they wanted to do this. I don't think there's a strong interest from players and from teams to play 3 different leagues at the same time. Some of them now play 2, but yeah. So that's how we got there. Yes, I mean, it's one idea we also wanted to try, but also something that everyone else involved supported.
I would add one thing to this, if I may.
Absolutely.
When Valve gets mentioned in this conversation, and just general concerned fans are watching, thinking, "Holy shit, I don't want one company to rule it all." I believe that everything that Valve is doing in the space points to the fact that they also don't want just a single party owning all of Counter-Strike, but philosophically they're interested in competition. And I believe everything they've done in the space so far, and you may argue they've done not enough or just about enough or whatever, but everything they've done in the space so far points to them not being interested in seeing just one party that is left standing running Counter-Strike. So I don't think overall fans should be overly concerned that there's going to be one company standing. And I personally, I don't have any illusions that there's going to be one single company in the foreseeable future doing Counter-Strike exclusively. I think Valve, if there's anything that Valve will step out and defend, it's the fact that there's multiple entities in the market competing with each other, because that seems to be their philosophy.
I'm aware that our hour is up. Are you guys still good to go for another couple of questions?
Sure.
Is that all right? I don't want to keep anybody if you have commitments. Well, so let's also talk about the kind of players in all of this. I know that you guys put a statement out from the Counter-Strike Pro Players Association, where it had a quote from their CEO that essentially said, you know, we love ESL events. They're the gold standard in terms of player treatment. We look forward to working with them, and we feel like we've negotiated a good deal. Obviously, I'm, you know, paraphrasing here. But then, of course, subsequently, with all of the revelations about, you know, certain teams essentially being removed from a league in preference of others, the CSPPA came in for a lot of criticism, had to put their own statement out, which to me was essentially a non-statement. You know, 50% of it was just explaining how an association or union would work. So I wanted to talk about the relationship you guys have with that entity and whether or not it does have an important seat at the table. You know, I noticed when I was looking at the Lanxess agreement, you had essentially the players represented by the CSPPA as one vote, you had the teams as another vote, and the ESL executive branch as another vote. And given how close that the ESL and the teams operate with each other, that essentially looks like a voting block that could always kind of vote against things players want. And not just that, of course, in a lot of instances in the contract, especially as it pertains to business, ESL just have a controlling vote, a veto anyway. So some people have kind of alluded that the CSPPA is essentially toothless because of that structure. How do you guys see it?
The version that I think you know is we had more in-depth conversation with CSPPA, so the player influence has definitely changed after that. I think, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, we like, you know, player representation where players have ideally unified voice. We try to establish it on our own to some extent. So we always had player meetings in the past. We tried to find out what they wanted to do. We tried to run things by them. We had a player council in Wesa that became inactive after a while for lack of, you know, interested participants, to be honest. So we had that, but obviously it wasn't fully structured and it relied on us pushing things, right? I think it's, for example, I think it's great that CSPPA now does player breaks, but we were the ones who established that. In the first place, we said, you know, this is what we'll add to the joint tournament calendar, which we set up back then, and this is the player break. So I think we're really happy that there's a unified body now, and we've talked to them a lot, and we want them to be represented in a lot of the things that both, you know, when we look at our relegation format, we will look at the teams, we look at especially at event conditions. We talked about that a lot. So, you know, on behalf of the players and through the players, there was lots of things that where we said, well, you know, we're going to commit to that because we think it's really important for players. We're going to commit to 4 weeks of summer break and 3 weeks or 4 weeks of winter break and all those things that are important to players, even though for us they might sometimes mean more investment or a little more requirements. So that's something that we think is really important. What we think the CSPPA is experiencing right now, and I think, you know, maybe not necessarily the people at the head of it, so CEO, I think they're more getting accustomed with the whole CSGO esports element. I think what the players are experiencing, that it's really tough to have a union like that is you know, on a vertical level has such a wide range, because you have absolute top players, the ones that get invited to everything, where they argue about, you know, how many events they decline, and if they're not playing too much, and how much prize money they get at the large events. But it all goes all the way down to the teams that are frustrated that those teams get a permanent slot in Pro League. And other teams have lost their slot and are not getting invited to enough tournaments and don't have enough chances. So I think they are at the stage where they need to be aware of the fact that they're actually representing a fairly, I don't know, heterogeneous group of people with very different interests, different per region, but also different in how they see things. Whereas I think most unions, say in a working environment, they typically represent a certain, say, level within that company, right? So they don't typically don't represent management, don't represent, there's a certain salary range maybe that they represent. So they have different interests, but it's still us against management. Whereas for the players, I think they're now seeing that it's really tough to be a voice for that entire group. And I think it's a good experience for them, because ultimately I've seen and heard some things that I think need to be streamlined. I think there's a couple of things like, how can players get benched? What happens when they're benched? Can they be caught in bench purgatory, essentially, where they're never getting out of it unless someone pays $1 million to buy them out? I think those are all things that should be addressed, absolutely. And we remain committed to making sure that the life on the road and in different environments remains good. But I think for them, they're now at the point where they've negotiated their first major agreement, and now they're seeing how difficult it is to act to represent that group properly in a way that everyone actually feels represented. But we're hoping that they can work through this and they can remain an important voice. I think especially for matters that directly pertain players, we absolutely want them to have a deciding vote. And that's also what, as we refine the agreement, what made it in there. Because absolutely, we don't want, if there's a scenario where essentially teams in ESL can always outvote players, that means they don't have a vote, right? So we didn't want to create that scenario, and obviously players wouldn't have accepted that.
Another question about another group that I think it's kind of, there's been a few concerns about. B-Site obviously made their talent announcement, and it was a very impressive array of Counter-Strike commentators, bringing big people from other games coming in, like Monte Cristo, people like this. And obviously for the duration of that league, they're not going to be able to commit to doing any ESL events that overlap with the B-Site project. It's essentially talent exclusivity, if you like. Now, some people have kind of wondered what ESL strategy will be moving forward in terms of talent for the broadcast, and whether or not they believe it'll have an impact on their broadcast product. But more importantly, moving forward, because there is a perception that ESL can be petty and hold grudges. I'm not saying whether that's accurate or not, but that's what some people believe. And some talent are almost afraid in a way to, maybe by committing to B-Site, they don't get invited to events run by a company that dominates approximately 80% of the calendar. So is there any discussion of that nature going on with ESL executives?
I would say when it comes to talent, and I'm just going to repeat what I think even you put that on Twitter multiple times, that CS is very, very rich in talent. And, there could be a tournament today in New York City and in Shanghai that has a AAA talent lineup just all over, both of those, including, 2 sets of commentators that are out there. So when it comes to talent, I think there's Counter-Strike has, the problem of abundance. So that's not really, a major issue. I could name you a large number of, desk hosts who could do a great job in Counter-Strike. I can name you a large number of experts. Obviously, some of them will be better than others at certain things, right? We all know how entertaining Thorin is able to be. He's actually become, I would say, a master at that, and that's why the guys over for ESL and Pro League never shied away from hiring him. By the way, I do think it's a very good idea to have people like Monte Cristo, like Thorin, be in charge of creative things and help tournaments creatively, because it's very, very clear if you listen to videos that he has put a lot of thought into, and he seems to have a lot of energy that's kind of untapped and unused in that sense to shape things, because he has opinions on how to shape things. And their talent lineup will be great. Ours will be as well. That's Counter-Strike.
And I personally, I think I've never experienced that anyone here held a grudge and there was a reason for someone not being hired. I mean, I can't speak for what happens, internally in the people that make the hiring decisions. Maybe that influences it, but typically, I mean, I think when we do talent, it's it depends what's the size of the event, where's the region. So sometimes we'll have commentators that cater to a certain region. Like in Asia, we'll have someone else. I forgot his name, so I shouldn't have. The anyway.
Black?
Yeah, exactly. So we hire him for events in that region, for example. I think obviously, I think the best example to me is someone like Duncan, right? I mean, it's obviously that famous incident why he didn't make it to one of our events.
Sure.
But then we made amends. I mean, we sat down with him and we said, look, let's work through this. And then I think he's been at some of our largest event, right? I mean, he gets to be in Cologne. And I'll be honest, it isn't always easy because we're obviously a large company that has multiple offices. So not everyone is a fan, obviously, of his frank and an open way to express himself. But we think he's a talent that for such an event works. So the only way where we wouldn't hire him anymore is if he expressed openly that he doesn't want to work with us anymore. So I think that's the situation we're in right now. But from our side, right, just because he works for B-Side, or even because he promotes B-Side, that would be a reason for us to not invite him to our events anymore, because he's there, for example, as a because of the qualities he has as a CS:GO analyst.
So there isn't any risk, say, for example, of it being framed, let's say B-Side occurs, and it's a success, and they're going to maybe do another event later in the year, but there's going to be a gap, where we're going to have all those great events, the Katowices, the Colognes. There isn't a chance that ESL would turn around and frame it and go, well, we went with these guys when B-Site was running, so we want to make a long-term commitment to that talent, and it doesn't make sense to hire those guys now because we've already established, these commentary pairings, this host, this analyst partnership, for example.
I think we wouldn't use it as a cover, say, to cover up a different reasoning for it. But I mean, definitely there are reasons why it makes sense to work with similar talent across the year, right? You can make an annual deal with them. You know how they work. The producers are used to working with them, so sometimes it just makes sense to work with similar talent. But and I mean, there might be reasons like B-Sides pays so much money that we are unable to compete with the rates that the talent now demand that have worked there. So that's another reason. But I think all of it would be valid reasons because we have to operate within a budget. We're also looking for something that's stability. And I think also on a broadcast, it's great if we have a team of producer and talent that has worked together for a long time. It just helps, remove an element of risk in the show that things go wrong or they don't understand how things go, or they immediately know if he gets told to hurry up, he knows how long he still has to finish the segment. But good talent is never going to be left out just because they work for something else.
Okay.
But for example, I mean, if we typically don't have Semler at our events, and then all of a sudden he has a 2-week window of it being free, then maybe it makes sense to hire him. But if we work with other talent throughout the rest of the year, then maybe it doesn't work for us there. But that's not an expression of us not wanting him, but rather if he's not available for the most of the things that we do, then it's more likely it will have other commentators that we work with rather than him. But other than that, I don't think there's any reason why we would say, oh, you're B-Side, so you're on our blacklist.
If you look at how we hire talent, we typically have the same people over and over and over because we're used to working with them. It's just more convenient to work with them and say, hey, why don't you guys do these 5 events and commit to these 5 events, and then we don't have to do the song and dance before every single event. It's just it's just fixed this way. So it's pragmatic reasons. I don't. I cannot recall any time where there would be somebody that would be skipped for like the typical regular stupid pettiness. But we do tend to to prefer, hey, why don't you guys come on for whatever, because that's just easier.
Yeah. So this is another big question. It might be the one that we end on again, because I am conscious of time, and I appreciate that you've given so much of your working day over for this to answer, questions I think the community, want answers to. It's been said by a lot of people supposedly in the know that the ESL Pro League is essentially a Hail Mary for you guys, because there have been a lot of financial issues within ESL, particularly stemming from the parent company MTG. So just to list some of these, obviously, there was a report about a big streaming deal in China that didn't go through. That was going to be worth $30 million. We saw MTG's share price, plummet 20% when it was announced that that deal fell through. If you look at the financials for MTG, they've clearly been losing a lot of money, on this product, on their esports portfolio, if you will. And there's been a lot of rumors that they are looking to sell to another company, perhaps one of the big companies like a Tencent or something like that. And obviously, I don't want you to comment on particulars, but is there a chance that if the ESL Pro League isn't a success, if it doesn't make the money that is outlined in the document, that was outlined in the Lanxess agreement that went out to all the teams, is there a chance that ESL is in peril long term? And is that something the community should factor in when they consider why you're doing this?
I think it's kind of an open secret that monetization isn't where it should be. I think in esports overall, I would caution everyone to look at all numbers that are reported, even large streaming deals like OWL had it to look at it, and still be aware that this is still something that is being invested in. And I think if we're looking at the majority of esports teams right now, they're probably relatively losing more money on it than others are in this space. And we've been building it for a long time. I think the only scenario I can see where it's a risk to our operations as a whole is if esports as a whole doesn't work out. I think there's a scenario where CSGO at some point might not be as important, and then we have to reconsider if we still invest there, or if we shift it to a different game. Obviously, in the 20 years that we've existed, we've had that a few times. We had a game, and then the life cycle ran out, and we shifted somewhere else. So I think that's a scenario. I think overall, everyone, I think both teams and us, we need to make sure that monetization improves on all elements, and that's really a core piece. I mean, none of it is at a stage where it's not where people expect it to be financially, but what's required is growth, right? And it's there's a clear trajectory, and I think that's also what the teams are looking for. Is I mean, where they invested now all this money into their lineups, they need to see a return of invest both on the tournaments they participate in as well as on the sponsors they acquire in general. That's the key thing for them. And for us, the key thing is just to make sure that both we grow the audience, but that also we monetize the audience better. And that ties back to the things I mentioned before, is that we just create properties that have a high value and where we can tap into budgets that maybe we don't tap into right now. But I don't think anybody needs to be afraid of this. I mean, at the end of the day, esports is doing well. And ultimately, people wouldn't invest this much money into it right now if they didn't believe there was something there in the future. So that, I think that's still the case. And for us, it's really about aligning with the core teams we know to grow the pie. And I know it sounds cliche, but we really want to grow the pie so that we can share it with everyone, and everyone can make a decent living. I think players are making decent living, but teams need obviously to be able to finance the salaries. And we need to be able to create bigger and better events. So that's what all of this is about. But it's not, our backs against the wall. If this doesn't work out, then nothing will. And I'll just say one thing, and it might be a whole different discussion, but I think, in a lot of the B-side conversation, I've heard things that talk about us as the middleman, and, we don't really need to be part of this. I think maybe there are scenarios where that's the case, but there are three parties, right? There are players, there are teams that play the salaries and have the brands and all the expertise to provide practice facilities, and then there's events and tournaments that are being hosted. Right now, everyone has an expertise that is really important. The players know how to play, the teams know how to run a successful organization that employs players, and we know how to monetize and run events. Now, if teams go and build their own league, they still need to monetize. They still need to sell to partners. They still need to run those events. So those costs are there, right? It's not like if you're running something without ESL, all of a sudden it's super profitable because we're raking in all the money here. And on the other side, that's not the case. I don't think that's a realistic way to look at it. But I think it's more about maybe also what kind of system you would like. And maybe in B-side, FACEIT are relegated to being an operator. Whereas right now, we think we have a strong expertise in selling and monetizing and in running those events. And we've built this for a long, long time. So really, the combination of all of these is what makes it work. But it's not like we're keeping the teams from fulfilling their whole potential. I mean, at the end of the day, they wouldn't be working with us if it wasn't something that they would also be excited about. If it was that bad, then they would just do something.
I would actually, on the money, I would say, a lot of people that just follow Counter-Strike, they think that we see ourselves as being in the race with, with a competition somewhere in some city, some country that is sponsored, I don't know, by esports pillows and some, brand new headset company. We're not really. That's why we created the ESL Pro Tour because across the years we've learned that the big brands, the big companies, the biggest checks out there, they're interested in having a property that's alive 365 days of the year. That's just one contract to sign, and boom, that audience we put the checkbox next to it. We see ourselves, and again, that's why we connected all these ESL ones, IEMs, ESL Pro Leagues, and then partnered with DreamHack Masters in order to create a product that the amalgamation of its viewership is actually competing with the biggest properties in other games, so that those other properties, they go out to to the Pepsis, to the Vodafone, to the AT&Ts. We go out there and say, look at that, our aggregate viewership is the same, it's larger, it's whatever. So actually we see ourselves as let's say in the race for the checks from the world's biggest brands, competing with the largest properties, not inside Counter-Strike, but actually outside of Counter-Strike, and that is kind of the biggest lesson we've learned across time, that if we generate that critical mass and we're able to, let's say, to the biggest brands sell in bulk, because let's say a Mercedes, they're not interested in if they go to Dota, right? In order to sponsor all of Dota, they have to sign contracts with 7 different entities. You have to sign, with this guy that runs this major, with that guy that runs that major, and so on and so forth. That is 7 contracts. That's way more work than they're used to doing for, to put a checkbox next to a sport, right? So what we're trying to do is creating a big enough package so that the world's biggest brands just have a one sit down, one contract, and it's done. And we're actually, again, not in a race with that tournament that's sponsored by esports pillows,
So look, I'll wrap it up here. I'm gonna just put one last thing to you guys, and you can give some thoughts, and then I'll let you get back to work. But again, it's a philosophical question, and that is kind of, what we've seen in this, announcements about all of these leagues. It's become this. Everything seems to be a battle. Everything seems to be a fight. ESL typically on one side, other companies adopt the other, like Allies and ESL and DreamHack and the SEA. They're like the axis of evil. You know, this is the kind of conversation I have a lot of when I talk to people over a drink. I just wonder if, you know, you guys believe Counter-Strike would be better served if you guys were the only, you know, party on the block. I mean, you talked about Valve's kind of philosophy and how they like competition. I do see ESL do a lot of things that suggest you believe in your superiority as a company, superiority of your ideas, and typically you don't really play nice when it comes to sharing the space. I think that's a fair summary. Given that Valve have made it absolutely clear they don't want exclusivity, you acknowledge that. Given that there are new companies coming in, trying new things, and that I think most of us would agree competition is good, is there going to be a commitment on ESL's part moving forward to maybe play a bit nicer in the sandbox and try and be a bit more understanding of other events and other leagues and other companies' rights to kind of, you know, bring something to the Counter-Strike table?
I think the first thing to say is that competition is good. The fact that E-League came around and E-League treated players very well, you know, you know, you worked on that project, and that the broadcasting standard was so very, very high. Just as an example, when we talked about the major in Katowice with Valve, after a period of not having a major for something over 18 months or whatever, 18 months to 2 years, we didn't have a major. And then we talked about that, and we actually looked at E-League and said, what the hell are these guys doing? That makes the, you know, the show is so crisp from A to B to C to D, right? That's what competition does. We sat down, we figured out how to make our shows crisp. And actually, you know, if you're the fat cat, you're also complacent. So I personally, my personal view, and take it for what it's worth, because I mean, I do know there are people that tend to, you know, not believe me when I say things. Duncan cough. But I do like competition. I like competing. I think it's healthy that we compare each other to, you know, to other companies, and figure out how do we best the others. I think our best period in Counter-Strike, arguably the previous 2 years, came when we looked at how E-League was treating the players, and we thought, holy shit, let's beat that. So we started, you know, anytime teams show up, we started one extra hotel room for a team. We rip everything out, or we have the hotel rip everything out, build a practice area there. The teams have a key, and now they have a practice area that's private. They don't have to be shuttled back and forth and do whatever. They can practice it anytime they please, right? Multiple other things that we do in order to make sure that the players are happy. And anytime I speak to the players, they're actually very pleased with us, and they really like us, and it feels really fucking good, right? And we probably wouldn't have got there if it wasn't for E-League being there. So I personally, you know, is it an easier life if you're just the only one? Probably yes, but progress comes quicker if there's competition. It's as simple as that. Progress comes quicker. Now, when it comes to playing nice, I don't know. I think we are as friendly as we can possibly be, and as selfish as we can get away with. And I think everybody in the space has the same attitude. That would be my answer to it.
Okay.
I think I'll say the same with some additional detail. I mean, I'll admit that a lot of the things that have improved on our end have been driven by competition, have been driven by someone coming in and doing something that maybe we haven't paid a lot of attention to, or that where we took ideas. I mean, PGL innovated a lot in say the HUD in-game production side of CS:GO. So I mean, without them, we hired their team essentially. They're not working for us, but I mean, without them, we wouldn't have that. I don't know if we would have spent the time to innovate that much. So I think that's a good thing, and I agree with that. At the end of the day, if I look at it from a business perspective, I got into this a long time ago because of esports. I didn't get into this to make money, and I think it's still not a motivation for me. I think it's still not a motivation for a lot of the people that make product decisions on the ESL side. But I mean, I have a responsibility, right, to my team. So I need to make sure that they can get their salaries, that they have their jobs in the future. So that ultimately means that we need to keep running a successful business. Now, often that's possible by being nice and just running our tournaments, but very often we cannot do that, and we get attacked. And I think a good example is we've been running our events, everything's going well, and then Blast comes in and signs a few teams and schedules events on top of ours. And all of a sudden, we have events that are missing some of the teams, and the players are all of a sudden. I mean, the Astralis players, for some reason, the Blast events just seemed more convenient to them to attend. So that's a business risk to us, right? We're risking our business. And at that point, I mean, well, we could just say, well, we'll power through and run our events, and everything's going to work. But unfortunately, at that point is where we need to do something just to protect our position, and it really is at this point about making sure that we can keep this business running. And it's not about me buying the 5th Mercedes or something that, say, the more monopoly-based sports federations have, where they're then giving. I mean, there's no reason to give competitions to Qatar outside of just wanting to make even more money, right? There's no need for the business. The business doesn't need it, but it's obviously a lot of money involved there. But I think we're at the point where really, if we just let this happen, and obviously it's it's a free ecosystem, anyone can enter, anyone can spend a lot of money to outclass us, then in that scenario we also need to make sure we react. And I think people look at us and think, well, we're this big, why do we need to do it? But esports is fast, right? If you could be gone very, very soon. And I think there's enough examples of big brands in esports that have run tournaments, and then all of a sudden they were gone. Their importance just went away because of something that happened in the ecosystem. So I think a lot of the times we're protective more than we are territorial or want to land grab as much as we can. And at the end of the day, and I think we need to do better in this, but I really want people to understand that the ones who design products on our end, all of them are esports nerds who played Counter-Strike or any other game when they were young and started working for this when it didn't pay any money, when it actually was a terrible career choice. I mean, I'm sure you can sympathize with that. So. And now, we didn't all of a sudden become a bunch of suits who were drafting agreements to outclass the competition, but obviously we grew with esports, and now we're doing some of the things that we just think have to be done as more and more outside parties with money discover the space and think it's a nice opportunity to make an investment and get rich. And I think that's the sad reality, is that there are more and more attempts of that as esports gets bigger.
Well, look, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. What I will do as well, just while you guys are here, so you can see that I did it for the purposes of the VOD and the interview, since the kind of controversy, if you want to call it that, as it relates to the ESL Pro League and the Mountain Dew League qualification, there have been a number of changes that were announced today, which Sam can probably bring that up on screen, but you can go and find it. It's on the ESL site. It's obviously made its way onto Reddit, and it does address some of the concerns, including that there will be a regional qualifier that will enable teams to potentially get back into ESL Pro League. And obviously some of the bigger affected teams that we know, Big, Sprout, Hellraisers, people like this, they are going to be included in those qualifiers and may find themselves back sooner rather than later, which seems to be a compromise of sorts. So you can go and read that, but changes are underfoot as of today. What I will also say is, of course, thanks to you guys for coming on. I know it's never easy to do these kind of interviews, especially as there always seems to be one crisis after another when you work for a big company. I can definitely sympathize with that. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know if there's anything you want to say just before we close out the broadcast.
I think it was good to give us the opportunity here. I think we're happy to share our perspective. One thing that I do hope we can do as soon as everything is announced is that we also let the team speak. I think a lot of the perception that we're bossing everyone around and trying to do things is also due to the fact that often it's just us speaking, right? I mean, Wesa is, I don't know if any of the teams ever spoke on behalf of Wesa. I don't think they really did. So I think once the teams are part of that conversation, can share their perspective, because they are a key part of this. How it's set up is we're actually not, it's not like we have any kind of majority in that setup, but it's ultimately a group of teams working together with us. So I hope that at that point we can hear from the teams and people understand that it's also their wish, including the one of the players, to have something more structured, more streamlined that helps them sustain the current business, and that people also realize that without these kind of pushes, the current CS landscape probably wouldn't exist. And I think that's mostly because of the teams. Because there's so much money in there that allows players to play full time that isn't backed by, say, constant revenue flows, but rather is an investment that hopefully will get recouped at some point.
Carmac, anything that you'd like to add just before we wrap up?
No, I talk about Liverpool, but I don't think people are interested.
We need to get the esports football podcast going. And I'd be cast out of it because I've started calling it soccer just to kind of get
it's
along
fine.
with my
It's a word of British origin, actually. So
I think it's okay, but people get upset by it. But anyway, like I say, gentlemen, thanks very much for coming on. Shout out, of course, to the show sponsor, .com. You can go and check that out, .com/RLS, if you want to sign up to that. And of course, to our patrons that support this show, $100 patrons, Jerky's Minion, Alice the Alchemist, Alisha Uzmanov, Reykjavik on Steam, and our $50 patrons, Benakagi Assassin, Butt Pounder 420, Carve, Flacksmith, J Dubs, Lipscomb Davis, Madsen, Marcus Kiumpa, Mike Feedme, Nemesis, Nikolai Lundgren, Sardsawar, Sunmade Raisins, TC Owens, Tobias Bonus, Scony, and Watchdog. We'll be back with a regular episode of By the Numbers and sometime next week. Stay tuned to Twitter, and until then, take care of yourselves.